Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah. 'Cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The legal scholar Gautam Bhatia, writing in the Hindustan Times, has said that a nationwide lockdown, as well as the government's attempts to mitigate for the very poor and vulnerable, raises critical constitutional questions. And these are issues on which, as yet, India has not paid sufficient attention. With me now to talk about the constitutional concerns is Gautam Bhatia himself. He joins us by Skype from Oxford. Mr. Bhatia, you point out that a nationwide lockdown that affects different people in different ways, and much more importantly, disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable, breaches the equality clauses of the Indian Constitution. Let me begin by asking you, can you explain the thinking that brings you to this conclusion?
Yeah, thanks. So to understand that, it's important to understand how the idea of equality has evolved over the years, both internationally and in India. So for a long time, the idea was that to establish a breach of equality, you have to show that there is a law or some state action that intentionally treats one group of people disadvantageously from another. So, a law that directly, for example, requires segregation, a law that does not allow women to be employed in certain industries. So you have to show that there is some very direct and intentional singling out of a group that is then disadvantaged. That was the thinking for a long time all over the world. It was understood after a certain amount of time that actually inequality is not the result of malicious or intentionally bad action by some state actor, but actually is baked into the way our systems and our institutions work. And I'll give you an example. So, workplace laws that, for example, don't allow for pregnancy leaves. These laws are neutrally worded, so they apply across the board to men and women employees both. But given that only women get pregnant, they disproportionately impact women and not men. So then this idea came about that even a law that's completely neutral on its face doesn't single out any group or individual, nonetheless can have a disproportionate impact or an effect on certain groups, because that's already how our institutions and structures are wired.
Can I interrupt at that point? What you're saying is that the lockdown is a result of a rule or a law that is neutral. It applies equally to everyone, but the impact that it has on the poor and the vulnerable is very different to the impact it has on the rich and the comfortable. And because of that disproportionate impact on the poor and vulnerable, it breaches the equality clauses of our constitution. Have I correctly understood that?
Yeah, so the lockdown flows from two laws. One is the National Disaster Management Act that the central government has invoked, and the other is the Epidemic Diseases Act that various state governments have imposed. And the restrictions on movement, on work, and all the other restrictions are a combined effect of these two laws. So you can see that the lockdown directly flows from concrete state action. That state action is justified to serve a broader public good of containing the pandemic, but it is state action and therefore the constitution is attracted. So that's exactly what it is.
And the equality clauses of the Constitution, which are breached as a result of this state action, is that just Article 14 or is it other articles as well?
Well, so it's primarily Article 14, and the reason for that is that as I just said, and as you said, the main axis on which discriminatory state action in this case is occurring is the axis of class. And so Article 15 of the Constitution has certain grounds on which you cannot discriminate, sex, race, religion, and so on, but not class. I think there are some gender issues as well here with regard to domestic violence, and we can discuss that in a while. But the primary axis is that of class, and that brings you to Article 14, which is the generic and broad equality guarantee.
Just to keep it simple, because layman listening to you may not understand the technical details, I'm repeating it simply again. Because the lockdown has a disproportionate adverse impact on the poor and the vulnerable compared to the rich and the comfortable, it breaches the equality clauses. And the primary equality clause that it breaches is Article 14. And I'll read that out for the audience. Article 14 says, the state shall not deny to any person equality before the law or the equal protection of the laws within the territory of India. Here, a law that applies neutrally to everyone has a disproportionate adverse impact on a particular class of people. That's why this law breaches the equality clause of the Indian Constitution. Am I right?
I should clarify a couple of things. So the fact that there is a breach does not mean that the lockdown is unconstitutional or that it should not be done. Rather, what it means is that when you're talking about the remedies that the government has to bring in to mitigate its effects, the structure of those remedies has to trace this fact that it's an unequal.
Absolutely. I'll come to the remedies in a moment's time, but there is a second sense, as you point out in your Hindustan Times article, that the lockdown also seems to question parts of the Constitution. You say that the lockdown has an adverse impact on the quality of life of the most poor and vulnerable, and as a result, it threatens the right to life guaranteed by the Constitution. And you say this happens because the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that right to life is more than just bare animal existence. Now, for tens, if not hundreds of millions of daily wage workers, their condition is reduced at the moment to a bare animal existence. And therefore, you conclude that as a result, this lockdown has actually breached their right to life. I take it this is Article 21 you're talking about.
Yeah, so it's basically, the right to life includes the right to livelihood, and which the Supreme Court held on multiple occasions. And so if your livelihood is deprived by virtue of state action, then there is a constitutional concern over there. But I'd like to clarify that it's actually, again, it's a combination of Articles 14 and 21. It's an unequal deprivation of the right to livelihood. And I'll give you a very specific example that we can discuss. So one of the things that's been a part of this lockdown and all lockdowns is this encouragement by the government to work from home. And if you actually, there was a very interesting study from the US recently, a couple of weeks ago, that showed intuitively actually that the ability to work from home is directly proportionate to your socioeconomic bracket. So the higher income that you earn, the more likely it is the nature of your job actually allows you or enables you to work from home. And the lower income bracket that you're in, the more difficult it is, and that's obviously very intuitive. So you can see that the people who will actually be able to continue working through the lockdown are those who already are economically privileged, and those who will not be able to work are those who are not. And so what you...
Once again, to put it in simple language so the audience can understand, you and I can work from home. We have the means, we have the technology, we have the education. A daily wage worker can't, not just because he doesn't have the means and the education, but the very nature of daily wage work means you can't do it from home. Because we are hitting a very interesting paradox or dilemma. You're pointing out that the quality of life of the poor and vulnerable is threatened, and threatened to such an extent that you're actually wondering whether their very right to life is now being threatened. Yet the government says this same lockdown is actually protecting their lives.
Yeah.
How do you answer the government?
Yeah, so I think that's a very important point, and I think the answer is quite simple. The answer is that we all agree that these containment measures are required to stop the spread of the pandemic, and ultimately protect the country as a whole. So we can all agree on that. Now the issue here is that in order to protect the country as a whole, or in order to advance the public good, what you're doing is you are saying that some people need to bear a greater burden than other people. And it also happens that those whom you are asking to bear the greater burden are those who are already marginalized, are already bearing more burdens because of the way the economic system has been built and structured. So you're basically saying that those of you who are least able to bear this burden must actually bear the most burden. So it's not a situation where everyone is pulling in together. It's that those who are least in a position to resist an economic hit are being forced to take the hit. Right. So that's the real problem.
Absolutely. And this is about to bring us to the whole question of mitigation and the nature of the mitigation and your view that the mitigation is not just a social or moral responsibility, it's a constitutional duty. But before I come to that, I want to ask you one more question about the two critical senses in which this nationwide lockdown is raising constitutional concerns. Is it possible, theoretically, for the lockdown to be challenged in the Supreme Court on these two grounds? First, that it breaches the equality clauses of the Constitution, and secondly, that at least for the poor and vulnerable, it seems to threaten their very right to life. Can it be questioned in the Supreme Court?
Well, I mean, so you can technically question it, but I think the issue is not so much challenging the lockdown itself, because I think that there is widespread agreement that the lockdown itself is necessary in order to contain the pandemic, and the WHO has agreed with that. The experts have agreed with that. And of course, there are some countries are going in other directions, but the choice of strategy to deal with the pandemic that's something that the government has to decide. So I think that is beyond the realm of legal or judicial questioning. I think the core issue is that having decided upon this strategy, the lockdown, and given the fact that its impact is an unequal impact, the Constitution then requires the government to come up with a remedial structure that takes care of the constitutional concerns that are raised.
Absolutely. And this is where, in fact, we come to the key question of mitigation, the manner in which the government is handling it, and whether it's an appropriate compensation to those who are most affected, who to begin with were also the most deprived in our country. Now, you write in that Hindustan Times article, and I'm quoting, it is the obligation of the state to mitigate the effects of the lockdown. This is not a question of policy, but a question of the enforceable rights of the people to begin with. Am I right in assuming you're saying mitigating for the poor and the vulnerable is not just a social or moral obligation on the part of the government, it's actually a constitutional duty. It's of a much higher order of requirement than a moral obligation.
Yes, because here the impact upon these people directly flows from state action, the lockdown, right? So that's where you locate the source of the government's corresponding obligation to ensure that the rights that have been infringed because of its action, necessary as it may be, nonetheless requires it to mitigate for that.
One more question before I come to the type of mitigation the government is implementing and why you believe it falls woefully short. Is this constitutional duty, as you interpret it, to mitigate for the hardship the poor face legally enforceable? Can this be grounds for going to the Supreme Court?
And in fact, there already have been petitions in the Supreme Court that, for example, have asked the government to ensure that there is payment of daily wages to laborers and so on. So there actually already are petitions in the court that highlight specific aspects of the lockdown and ask the government to ensure that the rights are protected in that context.
So just to sum up, the fact that the lockdown seems to call into question either the equality clauses as represented by Article 14 or the right to life as represented by Article 12.
And a combination of both. I mean, not taken alone, but a combination of both. Yeah.
But you're saying an interesting thing. The fact that the lockdown questions this are not grounds for going to court, because this is a matter of policy. It's within the purview of the government. It's outside the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. But what can be questioned and is being questioned is the fact the government is not fulfilling its constitutional duty of mitigating. That's a different issue, and that failure or inadequacy on the government's part to fulfill its constitutional duty to mitigate, that can and is being questioned. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes.
Then let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to address myself fully to that issue of mitigation, why you believe the way the government is handling it is inadequate, and what you think the government should do, not just in the straightforward terms of compensating for livelihood and loss of income, but also beyond that, the need to compensate for those who are unable to pay rents and are evicted, and finally, the need to bear in mind women, particularly women who come from battered environments or face physical violence at home, who have a particular problem. All of those, you believe, are constitutional duties on the part of the government. But first, a message from our sponsor, Glenn Livett, whilst I take a little break.
Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is the legal scholar Gautam Bhatia, speaking to us by Skype from Oxford. In part one, Mr. Bhatia explained that in fact the government has a constitutional duty, not a social or moral obligation, but a constitutional duty which can be enforced by law to properly and adequately mitigate for the hardship the poor and the vulnerable are facing under the present national lockdown. Now, Mr. Bhatia, in your article for the Hindustan Times, you write, what is therefore required is a comprehensive relief package that compensates for the loss of livelihood during this time. And as an example, you cite what Rishi Sunak, the British Chancellor, has done, which is to guarantee up to 80% all salaries up to a maximum of £2,500 per month. The problem is, what if the Indian government turns around and says, we can't afford to do anything similar?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a couple of issues here. One is that, of course, the details of the relief package are questions that are best answered by economists, labor economists, and of course not by constitutional lawyers. So what we can point out is that there is a basic threshold beyond which rights are violated. But the specific design of the remedies is, of course, something that is primarily within the competence of economists and the economic policy.
And I'm not going into the quantum of the relief.
Yeah.
I'm talking about adequacy.
Yeah.
Right? And it may be questionable at what level adequacy is achieved or not.
Yeah.
But if you believe that the government has to do A or B, because only that is relief adequate, and the government says we can't afford it, what do you do? Government decides what it can afford, and if it cannot afford to adequately compensate the vulnerable, what's the answer?
Well, yeah. So I think there's an important distinction that is there in both in international law and more broadly in the domain of socioeconomic rights, which is what are at stake here, and that's the distinction between what people call the minimum core and what is not the minimum core. So beyond the minimum core, which is what's basically the threshold that is required for people to live, with basic dignity, and ensure that basic needs are met, is something that's enforceable. Whereas beyond that, you have something called progressive realization. So the government beyond that can say that, okay, we are looking at our budgetary, constraints. We are looking at what to do, and we are progressively moving towards fulfilling rights. But the minimum core is something that's non-negotiable. And when you're talking, and I think that it's important to remember that every enforceable right requires the spending of money. So, for example, the right to vote requires ballot boxes, requires movement of paramilitary forces, and so on. So, this question of the link between enforcing rights and finances is a question that's not unique to socioeconomic rights. It's across the domain, and so that's why this argument that there is not enough money can't work when what you're talking about is the basic minimum core threshold of rights that are at issue.
Two quick questions. First of all, would you as a lawyer say that the level of bare minimum animal-like existence to which tens, if not hundreds of millions of daily wage workers have been reduced is way below the minimum core? Would you say that?
Yeah, I mean, so given that you've withdrawn their ability to work and sustain for themselves, then I would say that it follows from that at present it's below the minimum core. So at least what the position they were in before the lockdown, that probably could be something like a minimum core, because even then their position wasn't very good. But now even that has gone.
One other quick question. Are you saying that if the government cannot properly compensate for loss of livelihood, i.e., cannot guarantee that minimum core, then it's lost the legal right to declare a national lockdown? Or would that be going too far in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I think that's more a moral or an ethical argument, because the lockdown itself, right? If the government says that it is necessary to ensure that we save the lives of all Indians from this pandemic, then that is something that is the government's prerogative. But if in the manner of enforcing that, you are disproportionately burdening one set of people and are unable to compensate them, then that is, I think, a separate constitutional concern that requires a separate adjudicatory, process, delinked from the larger question of whether the lockdown itself can be justified or not.
Okay, we've established one point very, very clearly. The government has to compensate to the level of giving people what you call the minimum core. At the moment, it's not. And more importantly, the government can't say we can't afford it. It's a constitutional duty. You have to find the money to afford it. How the government finds the money is a matter of government policy, but it can't excuse itself from guaranteeing the minimum core on the grounds it hasn't got the money. Now, actually, in that article in the Hindustan Times, you went one step further. You say that loss of livelihoods need to be not just compensated for in terms of income, but you also need to bear in mind that people, when they don't have income, can't pay their rent and get evicted. And you're clearly suggesting that the government also needs to put a freeze on evictions. That's a second measure the government needs to do.
Yeah, so I mean, in fact, interestingly, there were two high courts, the Kerala High Court and the Allahabad High Court, that passed interim orders when the lockdown was first announced, so just before that, in which they actually went some way towards a temporary moratorium on evictions pending, the ending of the lockdown. Then the government went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, on an ex parte hearing, which is without hearing the other side, stayed that order, and therefore that put an end to that initiative. But yeah, I mean, to answer the question, I think it's important to again remember that when, because of state action, people have been deprived of the ability to earn, and then obviously, therefore, many people who live paycheck to paycheck are not in a position to pay their rent. Then, of course, it follows from that effectively they'll be evicted without it being, so to say, their fault. And so, again, you're basically having a distinction between property owners who are, less hit by the lockdown, and those who don't own property and depend upon rental livelihood and have lost their income and therefore can't pay rent. And so you've actually seen across the world calls for rent freezes, temporary, moratoriums on evictions and so on. Now, of course, the corresponding problem again is that there probably are many people whose income depends on rental income, retired people and so on. Of course, as distinguished from people who own many rental properties. But that's also something to take into account. So if a blanket rent freeze would obviously affect other people whose income depends upon rent.
Some sort of rent freeze that takes into account the problem for the poor is necessary.
Yeah.
And the reason it's necessary, and you hinted at that, is that this lockdown differentially treats between those who are property owners and therefore have homes, and those who depend upon rented accommodation for which they cannot pay the rent if they're not earning. And once again, there is here a question of the equality clauses of the Constitution.
Yeah.
People are being treated unequally, even though the law appears to be the same. But in fact, to pick up on a point you made, the Supreme Court may have stayed the High Courts of Kerala and Allahabad orders, which worked effectively towards some sort of freeze of evictions, but it only stayed it when the central government gave an assurance that it would come up with a comprehensive package.
Yeah.
That package is still awaited. Therefore, there is a sense in which the assurance the government gave the Supreme Court, on the basis of which the Supreme Court stayed Allahabad and Kerala, that assurance has not been fulfilled by this government. Surely, the Supreme Court can now step in and say, 3 weeks and more have passed since you gave us that assurance. This is becoming a critical matter for people who are getting evicted. You need to act fast, and if you don't, we're going to give you orders to do so. So isn't there now a sense in which the Supreme Court can act and order and demand?
And they can simply lift the stay. I mean, they don't even have to do anything affirmative. They already have two good orders by the High Courts that deal with the issues. So the Supreme Court doesn't even need to pass its own order. It can just say, okay, we stayed this order on the government's assurance. 3 weeks have passed, the lockdown's been extended, so we are lifting our stay until the government can show us what they're doing on the same front.
That this is a particular instance where the Supreme Court's patience and its willingness to give the central government more and more time is very questionable. Because as a result of being patient, the people who are poor and can't pay their rent are getting evicted. And they are suffering because the Supreme Court is being unnecessarily patient.
Yeah, and I think I just want to add one important point there, which is that now many people say that the Supreme Court has no business interfering with these policy decisions and so on. And we have talked about how this is a question of right, not of policy. But just to add one, I think, point to that, which gets often, I think, missed, is that what has been happening since the lockdown was announced is effectively a rule by executive decree, which means that the invocation of the National Disaster Management Act by the central government and the Epidemic Diseases Act by the state governments are basically, these are laws that have these broad clauses that allow the executive to do pretty much anything that it wants. And so you've basically taken parliamentary oversight out of the equation. So all that's happening is not going before parliament or the state assemblies, is not being subject to deliberative decision making, parliamentary committees and all of that. So effectively, it's the executives at both the central and the state level acting on their own without any check, which basically leaves the Supreme Court as the only institution where you can have any kind of debate or discussion on the basis of these measures, because Parliament's been taken out of the equation. So that
therefore creates even more question marks about the Supreme Court failing to raise this issue. Given that it is the only check that remains at the moment, it should be more active rather than more willing to be patient.
Yeah, and it's not asking the Supreme Court to basically manage the pandemic. It's just that ensure that there is a basis for the government's actions and that they're held to account in court. Don't substitute your wisdom for theirs, but ensure that they're being held to account in this court.
I'm interrupting you again, but there are many lawyers who say that in fact this is par for the course for this particular Supreme Court. It doesn't want to raise issues, at least not expeditiously, which it believes would be troublesome, awkward, or difficult for the government to handle. And it keeps deferring them, it keeps giving the government as much rope as the government wants. And therefore, this is par for the course for the Supreme Court, some would say.
Yeah, and I've written for many years now on criticizing the way the court tends to evade these kinds of questions by delaying until they become infructuous. So that's been,
One more question before I end. In your Hindustan Times article, you also point out that this lockdown, nationwide lockdown, is particularly problematic for women, and I'm quoting, who are in an abusive relationship or subject to domestic violence. As a result, you say, the state is obliged, not just morally required, but obliged to put into place immediate institutional mechanisms to respond swiftly and directly to cases of domestic violence. What sort of mechanisms do you have in mind?
So if you look at, for example, places, France, for example, has taken a lot of measures that involve setting up a number of phone lines, setting up a number of new shelter homes or homes for domestic violence survivors to go to. So infrastructural issues of that kind. And the Indian government has also said that they have really stepped up the number of hotlines available for distress calls and so on. So I think that's something, of course, one needs to look at. I think there's a larger issue as well here, which is that it's really a question of how our legal structures directly affect these things, and which again takes you back to why the issue is about law and legal obligation. So if you remember, a few months ago, there was an intense debate over the Transgender Act. And one issue was that the Act did not recognize the concept of chosen families. And by virtue of that non-recognition, ensured that transgender individuals would be continued to be subject to violence in their households. So the very fact that the law only recognizes these nuclear households and doesn't recognize something beyond that, again ensures that when you have a pandemic or something that requires people to be physically confined, the only recourse they have is to the same kinds of household structures that are responsible for violence in the first place. So I think there is a short-term thing to be done on the lines of ensuring that domestic violence survivors are able to access remedies on an urgent basis. And secondly, also to reconsider our legal structures in the long term that ensure that in these kinds of circumstances where you need people to be physically indoors, there are more options than just violent nuclear households. Yeah.
Very quickly before I end this interview, in part one, you said to me that there weren't really good grounds to question the constitutionality of the lockdown. You also indicated that the adequacy of the mitigation can be questioned, is being questioned. I want to ask you, therefore, do you believe the Supreme Court is taking that issue sufficiently seriously, or once again, are they kicking the can down the road?
Well, so the Supreme Court is not a monolithic institution. There are a number of different benches that have, been set up, and there are, many different judges hearing different cases. Now, in some respects, it's definitely not been enough. So you had the situation where, on the issue of payment of wages to migrant workers, the Chief Justice said that if they're getting 2 square meals a day, what is the need to pay wages? So you have these kinds of, I think, very strange statements coming out of the court that definitely, I think, speak to an insufficient understanding of the rights at stake. But then you also had one Supreme Court bench that did say that in a pandemic, testing should be free of cost, but then walked back on that in a few days. So I think that it's been a mixed bag, but I think broadly the problem seems to be that the Supreme Court is considering this pandemic as an issue of government, pure government policy, and is seeing its own role as a role that is, in a sense, intended to support the government instead of ensuring that this is a forum where the government's actions are called to account. I think that's the fundamental problem.
And what you're saying is the Supreme Court needs to, in a sense, and perhaps I'm using the wrong word, reorient itself. It is a forum very much needed today where the government's policies can be challenged in terms of their constitutionality. And that is something the Supreme Court sadly is reluctant to do. And I'll also pick up on that point that you made about how Chief Justice Bobde had said, if they're getting food, why do they need cash? It's been reported in today's papers in India. And when I read it, I said to myself, what a very strange thing for a judge to say. I suppose, would it have been contempt of court? And I asked you this as a question, if the lawyer to whom the Chief Justice had made that comment had turned around and said, tell me, sir, if you were to be given 5 kilograms of ration per day, would you be happy to forego your salary? Would that be contempt of court, to put it back as a question to him?
Well, no, that would not be contempt, but you probably wouldn't get what you want from the court if you said that. So maybe it would be strategically wise not to say that.
And maybe that's one good reason why journalists make very bad lawyers. They tend to be a bit tactless. They don't know how to say things politely, and certainly not to say it deferentially. My thanks to you, Gautam Bhatia, for joining us. Stay safe, stay well, and hopefully you'll be back with us in India soon.
Thank you. You too.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.